Hola, comrades. Today's topic of interest, Final Fantasy X-2. But first, some backstory. You should know of my struggle in assembling this video. It is by far the most difficult script I've ever written. I started writing this one on November the 3rd, 2017. By the time you're watching this, it will have been released on September the 1st, 2018. Almost 1 year after my video on the original Final Fantasy X, and 10 months after it was originally conceived. To say I ran into difficulties would be a nicer and more cordial phrase than I deserve. Part of my difficulties stemmed from my reluctance to make what I knew would be a long and challenging video while I was still in school. Senior year was brutal, and attempting to write a book amidst the madness only furthered my anguish. But that cannot wholly explain my reticence and anxiety. When the burdens of school lifted from my shoulders, I crafted a video on the Americans that was as long as this one will turn out to be. The workload alone was not the greatest obstacle. No, the greatest obstacle was constructing my argument. As I've said before on this channel, I often have difficulty attempting to find an angle. There have been occasions when topic and angle both emerge fully formed, and my task is merely to write the idea down before it leaves me. But more often, I have a topic with no argument. I have to dedicate myself to finding a fresh and personal take. Usually this is about why some element of the work I'm studying is great. For example, in the video I wrote directly before this one, I argue that an underappreciated element of The Sopranos is its effective use of anti-climax. Then there are times when I'm arguing why something is flawed, or how something has declined. There are of course analyses of mine that have little to do with quality, but most of them do, including this one. However, this analysis is more nuanced than X is good because of Y, or X does Y extremely well, or this one scene perfectly demonstrates why X is great, or this is what caused X to decline, or if X wants to reclaim its former greatness, it needs to do Y. The game I am analyzing, Final Fantasy X-2, is not bad. It's far from the worst entry in the Final Fantasy series. Its battle system is interesting and creative, while its storyline, while nothing special, does cover intriguing new territory. This is a game about longing and melancholy, and also about the struggle over the future of a new world. All of this is very worthwhile territory to cover. The music is hit and miss, but the tracks that connect, such as Memory of Light Waves, are as good as anything in Final Fantasy X. Little details like Wakka marrying Lulu and having a child with her that he names Vidina, the Albed word for future, add to the character arcs developed in the first game. However, it angers me more than any other Final Fantasy game. It is a terrible sequel. Unlike Super Mario Galaxy 2, its crime is not refusing to build upon the foundation of previous entries. Final Fantasy X-2, to its credit, does not fall into this trap, but it commits a much graver error. It pours gasoline on that foundation and sets it ablaze. This is like what happened to the Batman franchise in the 90s, when studio execs gave it to Schumacher and replaced the tantalizing, moody, stylish, stylized, gothic darkness of the first two films with cartoonish visuals that were supposedly a callback to the campy Batman of the 1960s, and yet were so much worse than anything Adam West and company created. Only, this is somehow much worse than that. Batman, as a superhero, is more an idea than a man, even says as much in the Nolan films.
People need dramatic examples to shake them out of apathy, and I can't do that as Bruce Wayne. As a man, I'm flesh and blood. I can be ignored, I can be destroyed, but as a symbol, I can be incorruptible. I can be everlasting.
There is thus room for different interpretations on Batman, and Batman himself does not have distinct character arcs in most of his films. He does not have to radically change who he is. The exception, of course, is in origin stories like Batman Begins. But once he becomes Batman, he is not exactly a dynamic character. Yuna in Final Fantasy X, however, has a character arc that is very distinct, and aching, and incisive, and powerful, and thought-provoking. It's something I still think about today. It's something I find my mind drifting toward when I'm at a crossroads, or when I question the beliefs I've committed myself toward. This makes her regression in Final Fantasy X-2 startling. I don't have a problem with her being happier and more carefree, and it's not like she's turned into a Pollyanna. She's still burdened with wistfulness and yearning, but she's become frivolous. Her character is not treated with respect or sympathy. Missing Tidus is natural, but that should not have been the center of her story. There really is not any narrative for her here. Her character beats either replicate that which was already provided in Final Fantasy X, or are just incredibly silly and insipid. And what is played as an important, gravitas-drenched juncture in the narrative, she gives a concert to unite the two warring factions. She literally works to heal a rift through the power of song. At least with concerts put on by the likes of Bono, there's a genuine purpose. People are supposed to watch the concert and then contribute to charity. Yes, these concerts tend to be shallow and do nothing to address the root causes of the issues they're dedicated toward, but hey, they're better than nothing. Here, though, the scenario is ludicrous. Two sides, both with what I would argue are legitimate concerns about the future of their world after the seismic disruption of 2 years ago, are fighting, and Yuna's solution is to help everyone get along by throwing a concert. Whoop-de-doo. And the most pathetic part is that the saccharine scheme actually somewhat succeeds. I'm insulted as a fan of nuanced, challenging, contemplative, transgressive art. I'm insulted as a fan of Final Fantasy X, and I'm insulted as a fan of Yuna. Because of what this game does to Yuna, as well as to Riku, as well as to the thoughtful, luscious, melancholy world introduced in the original game, structuring this essay puzzled me. My rage toward this game is perhaps more than I can logically justify. I cannot argue that this game is bad, because I do not honestly believe that. There's nothing wrong, in theory, with a bubbly, happy, shiny Final Fantasy game, and while the execution is vapid, it's not terrible. The series does have a tendency to tend toward overt and unnecessary grimness, so a step outside that is welcome as far as I'm concerned. But that candy-colored Final Fantasy game should not have been a sequel to 10. As I've said before on several occasions, Final Fantasy X is my favorite game ever made. It's the story of a young woman who has prepared all her life for a burden that she has been told is crucial, and so she decides to face it, even though it means death, only to turn against that destiny and question the entire doctrine of Yevon, the main religion of Spira, when she realizes how corrupt and pointless it really is. When she falls out of favor with Yevon, her faith shaken, she's caught by a young man who had learned how little he knew, and was shaken too, but he swears to help her. With him by her side, she has the strength to reject the offer of her namesake, Lady Yunalesca, and defeat her, destroying the final summoning. In a tremendous subversion of the trope of the self-sacrificing hero, her major act of bravery is to not sacrifice herself, and instead fight for a new world and a real solution, even though this goes against everything she had been taught. To follow that with this oversaturated mess is wrong. I wanted to rail against this game, but I needed a framework. I thought at first that I could simply talk about how it was markedly inferior to the first game, but that would not have gotten to the essence of my problems with it. Final Fantasy X did not need a sequel, but that it got one, and that I do not like that sequel as much as the original are not what I take issue with. No sequel could have evoked the same love that I have for the original game. My problem is not that this doesn't, or even that it doesn't try, but rather that it completely misses the point of the original. There's nothing wrong with a sequel that departs from the original if it adds to what has already been established. For example, The Legend of Korra is a markedly different show from Avatar: The Last Airbender, but it takes this different approach so that it can deal with more abstract, nuanced issues in a mature, thoughtful way. The objective is more complicated than defeat the bad guys and save the day. The 4 extremist villains in Korra are enemies, but so is the status quo, and Korra takes bits and pieces of what she learned from her adversaries and uses them to create a new status quo. Final Fantasy X-2 does not add to Final Fantasy X. No, it's not completely devoid of great moments. The points where Yuna reflects on the sorrows of her past appear to come from a much better, more challenging game. The events of Final Fantasy X may be years in the past, but they still are very much palpable, both to Yuna and the world. that Spira would be fractured after the overthrow of the theocracy that had ruled it for a millennium is inevitable. The idea that the Youth League and New Yevon, these reformist and conservative factions respectively, are engaged in a power struggle for control of Spira is a solid structure for a narrative. Yes, Yuna ought to have been involved with the political struggle from the beginning instead of being drawn into it by a sphere featuring someone who resembles her lost love, Tidus. After the demise of the ruling order, the natural transitional leader would have been Auron, but he faded away. An unsent, he stayed long enough to help Yuna and Tidus smash the false hope provided by Yevon and the final summoning, and to help them create the eternal calm. As Tidus faded out of existence too, the burden should have fallen on Yuna, but she did not accept it, and instead Spira fell into division and chaos. While she was only 17 years old when she embarked on her journey, she had the respect of all Spira by the end of the game, and that she does not use this influence to take a leadership role, and instead lets Spira collapse, should not have remained uncommented upon. But nonetheless, both Yuna's lingering sorrow and the political conflict are interesting, and could have come from a much better version of this game. While this game likely could never have approached the heights of the original Final Fantasy X, there was good in it. The problem is that the game as a whole exchanged the nuance and gravity of the original for cloying nonsense that it does not realize contradicts the entire message of the first game. The original Final Fantasy X is a struggle. It's a difficult journey for all those involved, not only physically but also morally. The characters grow on their journeys, but this growth is difficult, as it goes against everything they had believed, and because of this, the growth does not occur until they are broken absolutely. It is a game about sacrifice. Now, Yuna does not have to sacrifice her life, and no one sacrifices themselves to become the final Aeon. She realizes that this sacrifice is pointless, and it does nothing but offer a temporary respite from sorrow, but they do need to struggle and suffer to change from the people they had been. Wakka moves past his anti-El-Bed prejudice. Lulu makes peace with her past failures as a guardian. Tidus evolves from a childish, self-centered kid to a loving and respectful partner who helps Yuna and Spira's sorrow. Yuna herself has to reject everything she believed her entire life. They also have to endure the loss of loved ones. While no one dies per se, both Tidus and Auron cease to be. For Auron, this is painless. He welcomes it. But Tidus does not, leading to a tearful goodbye between him and Yuna. Final Fantasy X's overarching message is that it is possible to create a better world instead of having to abide by crude, brutal rituals that only ebb the tide of great evil instead of fighting it, but that sacrifice is needed for this better world to become a reality. Final Fantasy X-2 cannot handle this more nuanced message, and instead states that sacrifice is not necessary. If you want badly enough to forge a better world, then that is exactly what will happen. And those who say we need to sacrifice are cynical and unimaginative. Yuna declares about as much in a scene that functions as a rough equivalent to her resplendent speech to her namesake in the original game, but is much less effective.
Everyone was so happy. Great job, Yuna. You did it. You saved us all. There were too many smiles to count. And I know that I was smiling too. But now, when I look back, the people who should be here aren't. The ones who should be smiling with me aren't here.
We had no choice.
We had no choice. Always we had no choice. Those are our magic words. We repeat them to ourselves again and again, but you know, the magic never worked. The only thing we're left with is regret.
Yuna, I'm sorry.
No. I don't want this anymore. I don't want friends to die, or fade away. I don't want battles where we have to lose in order to win. Nuge, I know that what you say is what you mean to do. Give me your resolve. Believe in Yuna.
The declaration positions itself as a rejection of her actions 2 years ago, but it does not work, as her actions in the first game were about rejecting unnecessary sacrifices. If the message of the first game was that everything should be sacrificed for the greater good, then this could have worked, but because the message of that game was basically a more mature version of the message in this game, Yuna only appears as childish and pathetically naive. This is supposed to be Yuna's moment of character growth, but it's not growth. It's a retreat to a much simpler viewpoint and a demonstration of how unnecessary her narrative in this game is. Of course, the game had to present this as character growth for her because it had no other options. Other than getting slightly less interesting, she does not change throughout the events of Final Fantasy X-2. This frustrates me because there is a good storyline for Yuna here, but the game does not see it because it is unwilling to be anything other than its sunshiny, effervescent, overly enthusiastic self. She's so overwhelmed by grief and melancholy at the game's start. Why not have her internal journey be to move on from that? Have her accept that she will never forget Tidus, but have her finally accept that she will never see him again. Combined with an external journey that had her dealing with the political rift between the Youth League and New Yevon, instead of papering over it with the power of song and a few nice words about unity and togetherness, and she could have had a nice, smart, fascinating, satisfying character arc that was sobering but uplifting and actually had her grow in response to the issues she is forced to deal with. Instead, we are given an inert, wrong-headed rejection of the idea that suffering and sacrifice is ever needed to change the world for the better. This isn't character development, it's a cop-out. And while the climax of the story provides a clear example of the game's banal philosophy, it is not the nadir of this. No, that comes in the denouement. In the so-called best endings to Final Fantasy X-2, Yuna reunites with Tidus. I despise this decision. Yes, there are endings where Yuna never sees him again, but it's a reasonable conclusion that the endings which occur when you have a higher completion percentage are more canon, so I will declare that the true ending of this game is where they reunite, and also that this was a terrible narrative choice. Don't misunderstand me. I'm a romantic. I love Tidus and Yuna as a couple. If nothing else, they share the single greatest scene I've ever witnessed. It is in Macalania Lake, and it lasts over 10 minutes, depicting a long, solemn, intimate discussion of their own failures and of their own doubts about the future and Yuna's pilgrimage. It is a masterwork. This culminates in the lusciously beautiful and poignant Tsuteki-da-ne sequence that took over my life as a teenager and has only recently and slightly relinquished its hold over me. It inspired me so thoroughly that at the age of 16 I started writing an extremely thorough and detailed essay titled The Evocative Majesty of Tsuteki-da-ne, even though I had never before written any essays longer than those I wrote for school. I'll link to it in the description, but allow me to plagiarize myself and quote from it to explain why reviving Tidus and giving him back to Yuna undermines her character arc. In that essay, I talk mostly about why the scene by the lake works so damn well and why it is the true climax to Final Fantasy X, but near the end, I say this. X-2 lets her have it all. It gives her back Tidus, which is a horrible decision. Her actions in X, where she destroyed her old identity and the entire world order, need to have caused her permanent damage. Tidus disappearing from her life is a perfect way to represent this. He did not need to be brought back. Final Fantasy X did not need a happy ending tacked onto it. It already had a happy ending. Yes, it was bittersweet, but ultimately the positives outweighed the negatives. Spira was freed from its suffering. Our heroes found peace and found themselves too. Happy endings aren't just where everyone lives and gets what they want. And I stand by that. Final Fantasy X is extremely uplifting despite its dour grimness, but that uplift is not easy. It comes at a great cost. Final Fantasy X-2 is too simple-minded to understand that this was the right narrative decision, so it instead allows her to have everything back without sacrificing. Not only does she not need to sacrifice for her new triumphs in X-2, her old pains are relieved at the end of the game. I weep not only for the simplicity of this, but that I can almost see the X-2 we never got. A thoughtful, nuanced game that built on the foundation of 10 to create a transgressive, beautiful, aching work. There are much more obvious reasons to berate 10-2 than this. While I've criticized how the game treated Yuna's character, she is nonetheless still by far the most interesting character in the game. The other characters are bland, or one-dimensional, or cardboard cutouts, including characters that were more compelling in 10, most notably Riku. While Riku was a little ditzy in the original game, much of that could be ascribed to her age. She was only 15 years old. She was a compassionate, concerned, emotionally intelligent person that may not have been my favorite character in the game, but was certainly one that I respected. Until Tidus learned the truth, she was the only one who not only knew of Yuna's burden, but was actually trying to make her lay it down. Then in Final Fantasy X-2, they turned her into a complete airhead with little semblance of her former complexity. This change is translated into her change in outfits. While her outfit in the original game is practical and sensible, in X-2, her regular outfit is what I can only describe as sheer fan service. I don't know what my favorite part of this outfit is. Probably the pouches on the shorts designed to give the outfit the facade of practicality. Of course, this is the normal outfit for her. The characters wear many outfits throughout the game in the form of dress spheres, which function like jobs in the previous games. This is also mocked, but I actually don't mind it, though I will admit that it contributes to the overtly superficial approach of the game. What I mind more is the abrupt humor that is always less funny and more awkward than it is trying to be. Brother is especially embarrassing. Every instance of genuine, disquieting melancholy or yearning that Yuna experiences is tempered by a bad joke. Every genuine issue raised is diffused with an insipid comment. There's so much unnecessary and reductive material in this game. The entire main storyline about Shuyin and Len and Vegnagun could have been written out entirely in favor of a more grounded narrative about Yuna attempting to come to terms with losing Tidus while also forging peace between the two sides in a way that was actually smart and not overly simplistic. The plotlines about spheres are also overplayed, and it is disappointing to see that the substantial political discussions here don't venture beyond what to do with these things. Pain adds basically nothing to the story and is just a less interesting Lulu. The most famous scenes in Final Fantasy X have to do with heartbreaking revelations or romantic culminations or subversive turning points, such as when Tidus learns the truth about Yuna's journey, or when Yuna refuses to bow to the tradition of the final summoning. The most famous scenes in X-2 are the absurd hot spring scene and the sappy post-credits reunion scene. I could say that alone justifies my disdain for the latter game, but the truth is that I'm more offended that 10-2 completely fails to realize what 10 was about. I don't despise this game because of a few bad scenes or artistically offensive choices. I despise this game because it replaces characters I loved and a world I loved with bland, banal pablum.
I'll follow your orders, leader.
Aha! As leader, I order Yuna to decide.
Hey, that's cheating!
Final Fantasy X has meant so embarrassingly much to me. I can't think of 10-2 without comparing it to the original game, and it is not just inferior, but markedly so in every possible way. Perhaps I'd be a better critic if I could separate the two games, but the truth is that my connection with the original is so strong that I simply cannot. And in my defense, it's not like the game wants me to. The framing places it explicitly as a very direct sequel. References to the original game abound. While Final Fantasy X needs no sequel, there were so many options as to what could be done in the world of Spira, and X-2 tempts us with a lot of these possibilities without following through, which is almost worse than not tempting us at all. So if you liked what you saw today, consider donating to my Patreon so I can produce even more thoughtful, non-insipid content. Also, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that colorful stuff. Adios, comrades! Oh, and if you haven't played the original Final Fantasy X, do yourself a favor and correct that mistake.